The ninth meeting of the Efficient and Effective School District Governance Task Force. Please call the roll.
Senator Neal, Senator Tishner, Representative Bojanowski,
Here.
Representative Fleming, Mrs. Abdelahad,
Here.
Mr. Baker, Ms. Masden,
Here.
Mr. Nichols,
Present.
Dr. Nicholas,
Here.
Mr. Wartenberger,
Here.
Ms. Baker, Representative Tipton,
Here.
Co-Chair Nemus,
Present.
Co-Chair Banta.
Present. Thank you, and I want to recognize my co-chair, Senator Nemus. And does anyone have any guests they would like to recognize? Okay, and we need to approve the October 7th and 21st minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Nicholas? Second. Thank you. All those in favor say aye. Anyone opposed? Nay. The minutes are approved. We have a presentation today for the Council of Great City Schools. Dr. Raymond Hart is the Executive Director, A.J. Crabbill, the Director of Governance. During this interim, our discussions have been repeatedly focused on the need to compare Jefferson County schools with the similarly large districts across the country. The Council of the Great City Schools is an organization of 78 of those large school districts, including JCPS, and we have invited them here today to share insights into these types of school districts. Okay, if you guys are ready, please identify yourselves and we'll go on.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. I am Ray Hart. I am the Executive Director with the Council of the Great City Schools. My colleague to my right is A.J. Crabbill. He is our Director of Governance, and we have worked with Jefferson County, but also worked with, as you shared, 78 of the nation's largest urban school districts over the country. In the country. First of all, I want to thank Representative Banta and Co-Chair Nemus, the honorable members of this committee, and the committee members and the community members who are here as well. Again, thank you for having us here. We'll briefly discuss a couple of things. The first of which is our goal as an organization. The council was established in 1956. And our goal is to ensure that our school districts, our member districts from around the country, are educating their students to the highest standards. And so our goal as an organization is to make sure that we do that. In addition to that, we want to make sure that our districts are operating from an organizational standpoint as efficiently and as effectively as possible. That includes not only governance, but also operations. It includes academic achievement. And so we support our districts in every aspect of that. As you shared earlier, we provide opportunities for our districts to learn from each other, share best practices. And so what we'd like to do is share this morning with you a couple of things. The first of which is we'd like to provide a bit of an overview or setting some of the context for Jefferson County Public Schools relative to its peer districts across the country. We will have data relative to that, and then also relative to the state of Kentucky overall. And we'll provide that context prior to talking about governance. We know that your committee has received a number of presentations in the past about different governance models around the country, and all of our districts have various governance models that are represented. We will focus on sharing some of those governance practices with you, what those structures look like and which structures are tied to improving student outcomes. And then we'll also provide an overview of the work that we are doing with Jefferson County Public Schools, which is what we call our student outcomes focused goals and guardrails process. So we'll detail that with you and talk about what makes for effective school boards. So we know that your committee has received, as I shared earlier, presentations from a number of different organizations and agencies. We'll draw a little bit on that. We will make sure that we don't rehash that, but share some nuanced perspectives. One of which was a presentation that was done by the Southern Regional Education Board, SREB, where they talked about the trial urban district assessment process. which is a part of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Our organization, nearly 2 decades ago, spearheaded the creation of the Trial Urban District Assessment process, whereby a number of our districts, 27 now, started as a much smaller number, started at 10, but we're now up to 27, initiated a process where our member districts volunteer to take the National Assessment of Educational Progress and actually get data that is reflective of their districts. There are only 27 districts in the nation that volunteer to do that, but what it enables us to do is make comparisons across districts that are large urban districts, much like Jefferson County, across the country. One of the things that we've learned from that is that we can't directly compare our districts to each other. And I know you saw a comparison to Jefferson County. What we've learned is that our districts are made up of very different populations of students. And so even when we try to compare our districts to each other, we recognize that the students who are in the district look quite different. And so one of the things that we like to do is break that information down so that we understand better how we're performing relative to the nation, how we're performing with like students relative to the rest of the nation. And we've done that here. And so I'd like to share a little bit of that context for you as it relates to Jefferson County and the state of Kentucky. The first, and if you're familiar with the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and this was from 2022, what you'll note is that Kentucky consistently outperforms Jefferson County in all 4 grades and subjects on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And that is the case for most of our districts. But when we dig a little deeper, one of the things that we recognize and we begin to learn is that the educational opportunities in our districts for our students quite often actually exceeds that of the state overall and exceeds that of many of their peer districts. If you look at U.S. News and World Report as an example, and one of their most recent highlights of the top high schools across the country, 5 of the top 10 high schools in the nation were in council member districts. They were in urban school districts. So the educational opportunities that are afforded to our students are actually often quite strong. And you'll see that when we look at the data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, not just overall, but we begin to look at specific student groups and how they're performing within Jefferson County relative to the rest of Kentucky. And we can do this relative to other states, other districts as well. What you'll see is that, for example, for white students who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, Jefferson County actually is about 10 percentage of this is the percentage of students who are at or above proficiency. But Jefferson County is about 10% higher than the rest of the state of Kentucky. Similarly, for white students who are eligible, they're about 1 percentage point higher. What you'll look at across the board, if you look at black students who are eligible for school lunch, black student or Hispanic students who are eligible for school lunch, you'll notice that the state of Kentucky is slightly higher than Jefferson County. But the general picture that you see when you look at similar types of students, both by race and economic status, is that where Jefferson County is and where the state are roughly synonymous. They aren't very different. And one of the things that we try to do when we work with our districts across the country is specifically identify all the elements of the district that are important for improving outcomes for the students that they serve. And quite often, those improvements are not only beneficial to the district, but they're beneficial to their states as well. Because essentially the challenges that are reflected in the differential types of students within our districts, those same challenges exist across the state and across the nation as a whole. And so it's one of the things that we've seen that has been consistent. I'll just share with you briefly what that looks like. So this is 4th grade reading. So you'll see what 4th grade reading looks like. I'll also share with you what 8th grade reading looks like. You'll see that in 8th grade reading, and one of the reasons that these comparisons are the way they are with Jefferson County, you'll notice that there aren't all we don't have all of the possible racial and economic comparisons. That's because of just Jefferson County's population. Their population and the sample that is taken here only allows for certain comparisons because of the students that they serve. So you'll see, again, here for all students, again, the state of Kentucky is higher. But for the different student groups that are exhibited here, white students who are not eligible, Jefferson County is higher. For white students who are eligible again in 8th grade reading, Jefferson County is higher. For black students who are not eligible for school lunch, you'll see Jefferson County is higher. And then for black and Hispanic students who are eligible for school lunch, you'll see that the state of Kentucky is higher. But all in all, if you look again at the broader picture suggests that where Jefferson County is and where the state are roughly synonymous in terms of the when you look at like comparisons of the students that they serve. Briefly show math, same pattern exists, that overall the state of Kentucky is higher, but then when you look at individual student groups, who's better varies between the state of Kentucky and Jefferson County. And then lastly, for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 8th grade mathematics, what you'll see again, same general pattern, Kentucky is higher, but you'll see that Jefferson County is significantly higher for some groups, equal on others, and roughly synonymous in some other areas. In addition to that, I mentioned to you earlier that we want to make sure that our districts, not only from an academic standpoint, are providing the highest quality educational opportunities for their students, but also operationally. And we know that large school districts, particularly large urban school districts, seem to operate or function differently than smaller school districts. They've got larger, for example, administrative staff. The operational side of the house in our districts is quite different than smaller school districts across the country. And so we want to make sure that we are sharing best practices about the operations and other aspects of the school districts. And so one of the things that I share as well is a comparison here of where Jefferson County is relative to all of those districts across the country that have 15,000 students or more. And you'll see Jefferson County in red. The median for those districts is in the green dot, and then the state of Kentucky is the yellow dot. What you'll note here, and this is the percentage of staff who are teachers across the district. What you'll see is for the state of Kentucky and for Jefferson County, they are almost identical. It's actually decimal place difference. One is 43.6%, the other one's 43.3%. But in terms of the percentage of staff who are teachers, the district is right on par with all of the other districts in the state of Kentucky, and both are slightly below the national median in terms of the percentage of staff who are teachers, but both are right on par with each other. In addition to that, if you look at other data, I know one of the things that we like to look at is pupil to teacher ratio, and this is for all teachers in the district. Again, you'll see that Jefferson County is in red. Jefferson County is just below the median for all the districts that are reviewed. And the source for this information, by the way, is data that is collected by the U.S. Department of Education. But you'll see the state of Kentucky is just below Jefferson County. Both are below the overall median. But you'll see that Jefferson County, in terms of pupil to teacher ratio, is almost identical to the state of Kentucky. A couple of other operational slides to review as well. Just to look at administrative staff, and this is the pupil to total administrative staff ratio. You'll see that the median is the green dot, but you'll note that Jefferson County and Kentucky have almost the exact same ratio of pupil to total administrative staff, meaning that Jefferson County is actually slightly below the state of Kentucky. But in terms of administrative staff relative to pupils, it's almost identical. And then the last slide that I'll share relative to data, just to kind of set the groundwork, is the pupil to school administrative staff. And so one of the things that you'll note is that the first slide, the previous slide that I just shared, was about all administrative staff, which includes school staff and central office staff. What you'll note here is that Jefferson County and Kentucky, again, are about identical in school-based staff. What that means is that the administrative staff, which this essentially takes out the central office administrative staff, the administrative staff are on par with Kentucky as well. So in terms of central office administrative staff, school-based staff, the operation of the district is consistent with all other districts across the state of Kentucky. From a governance standpoint, and so one of the things, again, I know this committee is interested in the effective and efficient governance of the district, but what you'll see from the data is that the governance of the district currently is exactly where the governance of districts are across the state in terms of operations, in terms of student achievement and student outcomes. What we focus on, and our focus is working with our districts, again, from a governance standpoint, from an operations standpoint, and from an academic standpoint on improving outcomes for students. That is first and foremost for us. It is the number one thing that we do across the country. And we have been working with the Jefferson County School Board to, in fact, improve their governance practices, and we'll talk more about that. What you have heard from previous presenters and previous presentations is that the governance structure hasn't seemed to make a difference across the country in terms of academic outcomes for kids, et cetera. It is those practices that school boards do that make the difference for kids. And so one of the things that we focus on, not only operationally, but also from a governance perspective, is improving those practices. And across the country, we work with our school boards and our school board representatives to improve those practices. My colleague, AJ Crable, leads that work. And so I'll turn things over to him to talk about our core beliefs relative to that work and how we go about doing that and what it means for Jefferson County.
Our approach to school board governance begins with one basic idea, that school systems exist for one reason and one reason only, and that's to improve student outcomes. That the only reason that school systems exist, that we choose to invest as communities in having school systems, is to cause improvements in what our students know and are able to do. That if we are focused on that, then we are consistent with the mission. If we are not focused on that, then we have strayed from the mission. That this is the only reason school systems exist. There are many things school systems do, but there's only one reason school systems exist. School systems pick up children from school, they provide lunches, they buy books, they hire people in the county. These are all things that they do. None of these are why school systems exist. Our governance work with school boards begins with this simple idea, that school systems exist for one reason and one reason only. That's to cause improvement to what students know and are able to do so they can live a choice-filled life, take care of their needs, the needs of themselves, their family, their communities. The role of the board inside of that is to represent the vision and values of the community, to actually go out and listen to the community, identify what are the vision that the community has for its children, what should they know and be able to do, what's the values for the community, what are things that are non-negotiables that have to be honored. And the board's job is to go out and listen for these things, write the vision and values down, make them plain, and then constantly monitor performance to ensure that what the community expects students to know and be able to do, that the school system is getting ever closer to being effective at doing so, and that the values that the community has, the school system is getting ever closer to honoring those values. And so the coaching that we provide works with boards to identify what are the specific behaviors then that would allow us to do this, that would put front and center a focus on improving student outcomes, and that would put as a key component of our work as a governing body the listening for, the representation of, and ultimately the monitoring of the vision and values of the community. And so this is the work that we begun a little over a year ago with Jefferson County Public Schools and continue to this day. Along with my colleagues, certainly delighted to hear whatever questions you have and try to be responsive.
And just to wrap up for us, we look forward to answering any questions that you might have. But again, the sharing of what we do, how we support schools and school systems, and then also the governance model that we put forth is one that helps align the work of the school board with improving student outcomes, and then consequently allows that alignment to allow district staff to focus more heavily on improving outcomes for students. It is reflective in Jefferson County's work. One of the things that we noted as well as we looked at Jefferson County's data is that even post-pandemic, their recovery from the pandemic on your state standardized assessments has been faster than the rest of the state overall, which is again reflective of the efforts to actually improve student outcomes for the students that they serve. Now, granted, there's always work to be done, which is why we do the work that we do. Again, there's always opportunities for improvement. The data that I shared earlier, there's clearly opportunities for improvement, not only in Jefferson County, but across the state in terms of how we provide supports to our students, how we provide academic opportunities for our students. But our focus and our goal as an organization is to lift up for our districts how to best do that, what are best practices, what can they share with their peers and their colleagues. So with that, we'll thank you for having us here, and then we will open up the floor to questions and answers.
Okay, I see our first question is from Senator Neal.
Hi, thank you for being here. Appreciate that presentation. You've been there for a year now, and I assume during that period you've made certain assessments as to what the challenges are for the school district, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm noticing the disparities in these charts between white and black students and students of color. Hispanic, I think, is the other category you have here. What do you attribute to that disparity in terms of outcomes?
So I think the two things that you'll notice, and this is the reason we break the data down that way, you will notice that in a number of the charts, you are looking at, for example, the disparities between white and African American students, but the largest disparities are between white students who are not free and reduced price lunch and African American students, Hispanic students who are free and reduced price lunch. You'll also note that we didn't have, in most of the charts, only one has either Hispanic or African American students who are not free and reduced price lunch. It was the 8th grade reading, where their population is large enough in the district to actually get an estimate for them. It only occurred at 8th grade reading. What that tells me is that the preponderance of students who are in the district who are African American, Hispanic, are also in poverty. Conversely, you'll see that there are a large number of white students who are not free and reduced price lunch. One of the things we caution against, and this would take additional data analysis, which we could share, is making sure that we aren't comparing those students who are affluent to those students who are in poverty and addressing that to race. Quite often, it is the economic conditions that the students are in, not the racial conditions that not the racial reflection of the students. And so in this data, you can clearly see that there are economic differences that are occurring across the district. For our districts, one of the things that we focus on as well is what are the unique things that we need to do for students who are in poverty, whether they be black, white, Hispanic. You'll see white students in poverty didn't have the same performance as white students who are not free and reduced price lunch. So focus on the economic needs of students and what a district needs to do when the students are predominantly in poverty. For our districts, for the nation as a whole, about 50% of our students are free reduced price lunch. In our districts, about 74% of the students are free reduced price lunch. But we also have a graphic that we look at that we call abject poverty, where we look at those households in the community that are 10,000 or less in household income, 15,000 or less in household income, and 25,000 or less in household income. Our districts actually have a larger percentage of those students as well than their peers across the country. So when you talk about abject poverty, we have a larger percentage of those students. That is the real challenge, and that's the real challenge for us in terms of lifting up student achievement. And it explains a lot in terms of the differences that you see in those racial discrepancies.
Follow up?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. So the work that you're doing is to change those outcomes in result. So given what your assessment has been, the one you've just given, and the major challenges is more economic based with respect to that, what, in your experience across the country or other institutions that you've dealt with, what do you expect to happen in terms of that disparity? Given the understanding of that challenge, I'm not going to ask exactly what could be done, but what do you expect as an outcome as a part of your intervention?
So I think one of the things you'll begin to see There is data that I didn't share here, but we can share it. There's data from the Education Recovery Scorecard, which was data that was done by researchers out of Harvard University and Stanford University. There's also data in a report that we provided is on our website, cgcs.org. That report is called Mirrors or Windows. And we ask ourselves in that report, did a statistical analysis using NAEP data. Are there places in the country where districts are, the reason we use the title Mirrors or Windows, are there districts that are reflections of the students that they serve, or are they actually windows giving their students an opportunity to see a different possibility for themselves? And we identified in that report where districts are overcoming the barriers of poverty, racial disparities, et cetera. And so we've highlighted what are best practices there. What you'll see in the Jefferson County data on the Educational Recovery Scorecard is they actually, unlike many districts across the country, have closed those racial disparity gaps in the data that was just reached from your state assessment. They used state assessment data from 22-23. So they are starting to close those gaps. What we would expect from our work is that they would continue to close those gaps by continuing to implement best practices from both a governance standpoint, clearly focusing on the needs, again, of the students that they serve, the unique nature of the students that they serve. I expect those gaps to continue to close as they move. In addition to that, making sure that they continue to learn from their peers. And that report that I talked about on our website, Mirrors or Windows, we actually highlighted and visited. So after we identified the statistical changes, impacts that they had on students, we went and visited about 8 districts. And we've highlighted in that report, these are the best practices from those districts that really influence moving the needle on student achievement. AJ, did you want to address anything?
Thank you very much.
Okay, Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you very much. On the slides, Jefferson County, Kentucky, do you have similar slides that show Jefferson County relative to the great city schools on NAEP assessments? And could you possibly share those with the committee?
We can put that together and share those with the committee. Didn't want to do it from a time standpoint
great.
here, but absolutely,
Really
yes,
interesting.
we do.
May I ask one more?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So school systems exist for one reason only, and that's to improve student. The only outcomes we've been discussing are test scores. I'm a special ed teacher for JCPS, and I've got to tell you, I'm improving my student outcomes every day, but that will never be reflected in their test scores. So can you speak on, are there other measures other than standardized test scores that we're looking at as far as student outcomes?
So the coaching that we provide is that boards have to listen to the vision and values of their community, and from that discern which outcomes they most want to be focused on. And so in some situations, boards say they are most hearing from their community that their focus needs to be on scores that are coming out of state assessment. In other communities, they're hearing other things. And so it is not our role to tell them what the vision and values of their community should be. That needs to be made by each individual school board. That's what they are selected to do. It is our assertion that they do need to identify which student outcomes are most important in their community, and they do need to identify what is a means by which we will measure them, because if we cannot measure them, we cannot know if we are actually moving the needle on improving them. And so in some cases, school boards will be concerned specifically with state standardized tests. In other districts across the nation, they are looking more at local assessments. Sometimes they're looking at things that are academic in nature, sometimes they are not. But that decision, which vision and values to be focused on, is a local decision, certainly not something that we would prescribe, and so certainly not something that nationwide remains exclusively focused on standardized assessments.
Okay, Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Hart, Mr. Crabbill, thank you for being here today and providing your expertise. You mentioned in your testimony that I believe you had 5 of your member schools in the top 10 listed that they're doing very well. What are some of the best practices? You talked about best practices. What are some of the best practices and characteristics of your member schools that are doing well that maybe JCPS and other districts could emulate?
We'll do a couple of things. We'll talk about it from a governance perspective, but then also from an operational perspective. In the report that I mentioned to you, the Mirrors or Windows report, in our visits to schools, one of the things that we highlight is, for example, the longevity of the superintendent. We highlight of which Jefferson County has, and it's part of the governance support work. What happens with the longevity of a superintendent is they are able to move the needle and kind of stabilize a district long term. That stability is critical, and it doesn't necessarily have to come in longevity. In some cases, we noted that we saw significant academic achievement even when there was a continuum of previous practices with current practices, when the superintendent changed. In addition to that, again, from a governance standpoint, which I'll let AJ reference, what we particularly note is the ability of the board to stay focused on student outcomes independent of other things that are going on across the district. And that's the work that we do with our school boards to make sure that the board remains focused, which enables the staff to remain focused. That focus on identifying what are the critical needs of our students, really understanding root causes of the challenges that students are facing as they walk in the door, and then addressing those is important. So, AJ?
In terms of what are things that we're seeing across the nation that seem to be positively correlated with improvements in student outcomes, certainly it's important to note that the thing that matters most that the school system can control is what's the quality of instruction that's taking place in the classroom. That's where the magic happens. And so that is always where the strongest correlation with improvements is going to be, is when we're causing improvements in the quality of instruction that students are experiencing day to day. So the school board is certainly quite a distance away from the classroom. That being said, we do have some evidence about what things happen in the boardroom that do tend to echo in the classroom. And so some of the things, which you've already heard, is one, leadership tends to matter, a stability of leadership, and particularly a stability of vision. If school boards cause a school system to jump to a new set of priorities every year, that seems to not be positively correlated with improvements in student outcomes. Essentially, over time, your effective staff will simply tune that out. They'll determine that the board is ineffective and instead just kind of buckle down and what can I do in my classroom and ignore all the noise outside. And so to the extent that governance teams can create stability and a clarity of focus and maintain that over time, that seems to have a meaningful impact on the organization's overall capacity to improve student outcomes. In addition, clarifying what are the things that matter most and then aligning resources with them appears to be significant. The alignment of resources does not only come through budgeting, but certainly it does. One of the things that we coach boards to do is to make sure that they have clarity about how the vision and values of the community that they've adopted in goals and guardrails are reflected in the budget. Part of the reason this is a challenge is because the way most states operate is they expect a budget that is provided that describes topical buckets of expenditure. That in no way provides insight into, are we making strategic deployments of resources that's aligned with the vision and values of the community? And so our coaching winds up being that in addition to the statutorily required view of budgeting, there also has to be this aligned view of budgeting. That's how are we deploying resources in a way that actually matches the student outcomes that we're trying to improve. In addition to alignment of resources regarding that, it also has a lot to do with what are the expectations the board places on the superintendent. Again, if the board's expectations seem to bounce around and are constantly different or constantly chasing whatever kind of the latest catastrophe is, then the superintendent will follow that. And instead of having a laser focus, it'll be this mercurial focus that never seems to manifest in one place. And unfortunately, that seems to have a profound impact throughout the rest of the organization. When the board is constantly wavering, staff tend to unfortunately follow their lead. The good news is that when the board is steady and focused, the staff tend to follow their lead as well. Finally, how boards spend their time seems to matter significantly. When boards actually spend a meaningful amount of time monitoring progress, the message they send to the organization is that progress relative to our community's vision and values matters more than other things. When the board doesn't spend a meaningful amount of its time actually monitoring progress, then it sends the message that whatever the fire of the day is, and with school systems as massive as JCPS is, there's always going to be some fire of the day. Boards that constantly are trying to be firefighters send the message that that is what matters most. And so then the student outcomes that they have claimed are the priority never actually become the priority in the eyes of staff. And so those things, how can we be clear about leadership, stability, and focus? How can we be clear about resource allocation and focus? How can we be clear about the board's time use and focus? These are three specific examples of things that in the research literature seem to have some positive correlation with improvements in student outcomes.
Okay,
Could you indulge in one brief follow-up to his comments?
go right ahead, Representative.
Kentucky's fairly unique to the nation in that we have site-based decision-making councils in our schools across the state. In your evaluation of JCPS, have you been able to discern any conclusions under that structure versus districts across the nation that are more school board-led?
So I don't have a response to that. Ray might. I would say that site-based decision-making is actually fairly common, and that many of the districts in the council experience that approach as well, where there is a significant amount of autonomy that is devolved to the site location rather than centralized. I have personally seen research that speaks to there being benefits to that and there being cost to that. And so I don't know that there's a clear consensus one way or the other, but I do know that the phenomenon you're describing does exist in a lot of other localities around the country. And so it is something that could easily be evaluated by your legislative team. And we gladly provide you with several other districts and states that use a similar approach.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Woudenberger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here and providing the information. I think others took. Real quick, what I heard you say pretty loudly is that adjusting student populations for demographics and economics, that JCPS is on par with the rest of the state. Is that fair? And when I say on par, I should cover governance from a governance standpoint, an operational standpoint, and academically. Is that what you said?
So when you look at the data, on par, in some cases better than the rest of the state, in some cases not. But yes, overall, when you look at the demographic makeup of JCPS and look at the performance of those students in those demographic groups relative to the performance of the same students in the same demographic groups across the state, yes.
Okay. Just had one more.
Yes, please.
So with respect to the discussion on best practices in your work with JCPS, have you identified those practices, those related to instruction opportunities for JCPS compared to other districts outside of Kentucky?
So we've worked with a number of JCPS staff in many different ways, and we've also, one of the things that we do as an organization is try to make sure we connect the staff in our member districts to each other so they have an opportunity to learn from each other. And so the answer to that is yes. Many JCPS staff have been connected to their peers and their colleagues across the country, specifically as it relates to academic instruction, as it relates to school operations, as it relates to district operations and other operational areas. But the answer is yes. And what we do is make sure that they are continuously sharing best practices, improving not only in the district, in their states, but improving relative to districts across the country as well.
I have a quick follow-up.
Sure.
Just to touch on that, so I understand you're connecting them, and so they're coordinating and collaborating with other districts. But have you and your staff identified specific things that, looking at instructional best practices that JCPS employs, that there are gaps maybe, or opportunities, if you will, between what they practice every day and what other member districts?
I haven't done it directly. We do have an academic team that anytime our districts reach out and ask us questions about what can they improve upon, where they can look, we do go in and look at that. Our academic team quite possibly could have provided that. As a matter of fact, I know they provided it for some of the JCPS staff. But in terms of specifically what they provided, I would have to talk to my staff to answer that.
If you could, and that would be good to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nichols?
I believe my question is for Mr. Crable, but if Dr. Hart would like to answer as well. I'm wondering, Mr. Crable, is there any research that aligns with your assertions on how school boards should be run? And have you done any peer review with your assertions on what school boards should do and how they should operate?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of available evidence in the research literature specific to school board leadership and the impact it has on student outcomes in their school systems. And we'd be happy to provide you a full bibliography of things that we'd encourage y'all to read, to look into it. It is not nearly as strong and robust as the research base around superintendent leadership, for example, or the evidence base around principal leadership, for example. But it does exist. It's just a little bit more nascent. And so the coaching that we provide is definitely grounded in that. And again, we can forward to you a full bibliography of the literature that we rely on for the coaching that we provide. To the second part of your question, is there any type of evidence around boards actually changing their behaviors and having an impact? What we can provide you as well is with a study, this was done in Texas, that really looked at what is the impact of school systems that are doing this type of work, where the board is saying we want to be intensely focused on improving student outcomes, and we're going to change our behaviors in ways that are consistent with that. In the study this professor did, they divided all of the school systems in the study into three groups. The control group, which was the LEAs that had no treatment. The partial treatment group, which is the LEAs that were provided training on how to be student outcomes focused, but were not provided with any coaching to implement those practices. And then the full treatment group that was provided both training and coaching to implement that training. What they found when comparing those three control groups and the scale score improvements and state accountability data for their students across those groups is that the average increase for the control group was 4 scale score points. The average increase for the partial treatment group, which received training but no coaching to implement the training, was about 4.25. So statistically, it really was not that much movement. This actually validates something that we often see in research around the efficacy of teacher training as well, is that training by itself does not appear to significantly move the needle. That seems to be the case in the classroom. The evidence suggests that that's also the case in the boardroom. And then the average movement for the full treatment group was 8 points, essentially a 2x change over the control group. What it suggests is that while the board is certainly a much lower leverage entity than teachers all day, every day, I don't think anyone's questioning that. It does, however, suggest that there are behaviors in the boardroom that do seem to echo in the classroom, and that as boards change their behavior, they can either make it easier for the educators to be effective or harder for the educators to be effective.
Thank you. I look forward to reviewing that research.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Baker.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My question is also for Mr. Craybill. Earlier, I want to go back to a statement you made earlier, which is that it's important for the school board to represent community vision and values. We have gone into the Jefferson County District at different schools and been able to get a lot of community feedback, but I'm just curious as to what the JCPS board has articulated to you all as their vision and values and their main goals.
And so part of the process is that you can't possibly represent the vision and values of a community that you haven't actively gone out and listened to. And so at the very beginning of our process when working with school systems is the coaching that suggests that they need to be systematic in going out and listening for the vision and values of their community. The systematic part of that, however, is what's quite crucial. With communities as large as the districts that we serve are, it is really essential that they try to do as wide a set of listening as possible. What often happens is that people hear non-representative samples of the community. And so I hear from the people in my neighborhood, and then I want to extrapolate that as if that is the full voice of the community. I hear the people from just this one school, and that's actually not effective. that it is absolutely incumbent upon the board that they have to take an approach to trying to listen to a representative sample. Normally, the way they accomplish this is doing what JCPS does, like how can we do some listening scattered around, and then can we identify, are there any target groups that we haven't heard from, and can we do targeted listening with those to round out the data set? What happens then is after they've collected all of that data, then either the district will take it and analyze it, or they pass it on to us and we'll analyze it. In the case of JCPS, they passed it to us, and I personally led the analysis of the data. And so there are thousands and thousands of data points that they received from this community listening. And then what we did is ran a topical frequency analysis on that to identify which specific ideas came up the most across all of the listening across the entire county. And then we provided that back. Then when the board went to set their goals and their guardrails, what they believe represent the vision and values of the community, they were setting that based on that analysis that we conducted of all of the listening, which again, our job was not to interpret the community's wishes other than to try to identify which of the community's wishes came up with the greatest frequency. And so that frequency analysis is a large part of what the board based their decision making on.
Yes, please.
Can you give us some examples of what the top topics were or that came up in that analysis?
Yes. If we can maybe go on to the next question, I will actually pull that document up and read from it for you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll circle back around. All right, Ms. Abdallahat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a lot of the same questions, so I think I've changed my question about 5 times. But what I got to is, and thank you guys for being here. I heard a lot about your organization, especially during the transportation situation. So what is the correlation between school district governance and the effectiveness of the board, or the ability of the board to be effective?
By school district governance, you mean like type of
I just
governance?
mean if the school district isn't governed effectively in itself, I'm going to believe that takes away the ability for the board to be effective too. Does that make sense? Like if the district is inciting change, kind of mayhem or chaos a little bit internally, and the board is having to react to the fires that are sort of self-imposed and not externally imposed, that has to limit their ability to be effective.
Thank you for that example. That gives me better insight to what you're asking. So when we're working with boards, and again, we exclusively are working with the largest school systems, urban serving school systems in the nation, there is never going to be a day where there is not a fire.
Sure.
And so if the position of boards is we have to pivot and allocate all of our time to each fire, they will never reveal to the organization the steady hand of leadership that is required to be engaged in the continuous improvement process. So unfortunately, what that means as a practical matter is that there has to be some amount of discipline to say that there are some fires that are so flamey that we got to focus on.
Sure.
But that a lot of these fires, we have to delegate that to the superintendent and trust that their staff will sort that out, only because the cost of us chasing all of them is that we will leave children behind.
Sure.
And when boards fail to be focused, when they fail to be disciplined, the repercussions of that failure are not evenly distributed across all the students. They tend to disproportionately plague the children who are already furthest from educational justice, the children who are already struggling the most, who needed the organization to be focused for them to get what they need. Those are the children who wind up struggling the most. And so, yes, there are always going to be challenges. The general coaching view that we provide is that the board has to be very judicious and actively avoid chasing those fires. They have an oversight role, but they can't go far beyond that. Otherwise, they will spend all of their time in fires and none of their time in student outcomes.
If I may, as well, and the basis for that coaching actually is not just with boards. If you're familiar with the text, there's a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It was written by Covey and others. That book talks about the whirlwind versus the wildly important goal. And essentially with all organizations, there's always going to be the whirlwind. The successful organizations are able to manage the whirlwind while staying focused on the wildly important goal. And essentially our coaching for boards is understanding how 50% of your time should be spent on the wildly important goal. It doesn't mean that you don't address the issues that come up in the whirlwind. It's a part of what you do. The similar for staff. Staff have to deal with the whirlwind, but what you want them to do is be able to focus and stay focused on the wildly important goal. It applies to all organizations, not just school districts. And so part of our coaching is, in fact, that it's here's what the wildly important goal is. While we manage the whirlwind, we're going to stay focused on what we're trying to accomplish.
Just a quick follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Thank you. Are you actively also providing that coaching to the JCPS district itself and also the board, or just the board?
When we take our school boards through this process, one of the things that we do is actually prepare the staff for the shift that occurs at the board level. And so that, yes, the answer is we take the staff through the exact same process and coaching. An important part of it, obviously, the coaching for staff is different than the coaching for the boards, but they are in lockstep. And it's helping both the staff and the cabinet staff, the senior level staff, and the school board understand how this shift in thinking will keep you both focused on the wildly important goal while continuing to address the whirlwind.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baker.
Madam Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you mind just sending that to us, because we are quickly running out of time? Thank you very much. Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I have two questions? I'll ask mine on the front.
Two, one at a time.
And I'll be quick. On the first question I have, one, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time and all the information that you've given. The first question I have is, I know that when Superintendent Polio first got into that role, he asked the board, or he reached out to you all to do an overview of the structure of JCPS. Can you give us a little context or an overview of what came out of that and what has been implemented from that?
So we haven't gone back to study what's been implemented from that. We can, but one of the things that we do when we provide, particularly for our districts, is kind of an organizational structure. What does it look like to structure yourselves in a way that will focus the attention of the district on student outcomes while addressing other operational challenges, and also making sure that all the departments in the district, whether I'm providing food services, custodial services, et cetera, that everyone is focused on student outcomes and student achievement. And so we made recommendations relative to that. I'd have to go back and look at and ask Superintendent Polio where they are in that implementation process, but it's something that we do regularly for our districts.
Sorry. Do you mind sending, I guess, that as well?
I can send you our original report. I don't know, again, where they are in the implementation.
Okay. Thank you. The second question I have is, I actually pulled up the windows and mirrors. From what I can ascertain, great work. But I wanted to talk about these glaring racial demographic changes and talking about the social economics of the children. And skimming through it, and I'll read it just for the record. There's a part on page 45 at the top of the page that kind of touches on this, and it says, in the context, the inability of school districts in these communities to make academic gains, and it's talking about similar, social economics in specific neighborhoods. To make academic gains is hardly surprising. School districts, I'm sorry, my glasses, give me a read. I'm getting older. Let me start over. In this context, the inability of school districts in these communities to make academic gains is hardly surprising. School districts sharing this history may simply need more time, greater reinvestments, and the right strategies before academic improvements can take root. School districts like Cleveland and Shelby County and Memphis, which have demographic characteristics like those which constantly gain negative district effects, have been pursuing their reform efforts for an extended period and have seen gains. This suggests that improvements are possible once the right supports, investments, and strategies are put into place and sustained, but it may take longer than just a few years to address the cumulative effects of centuries of oppression, disinvestment, and disenfranchisement. So I read that with asking just a simple question: what type of gains that have you seen that these school districts have implemented to be able to improve student outcomes that we can model and copy for JCPS?
So I think you'll note, and I think you're reading probably from the abject poverty section of that report.
Yes.
But if you look at those districts, Cleveland, for example, this year became a 3-star district for the first time in the district's history. Again, they had a superintendent who was in place for 10 years. They've got now a new superintendent who has continued some of the supports of the previous superintendent. But what we see is that when districts make those investments, and when, quite frankly, states and the federal government make investments in districts, they are actually able to improve. Jefferson County is a prime example of that, particularly coming out of the pandemic. The pandemic had significant impacts on our children across the nation, but the fact that they're recovering faster than the rest of the state is indicative of what it means to focus on student outcomes and also make investments in our kids. And so some of those investments are paying off, not just in Jefferson County, but across the country. And I could go into greater detail, but I know we're time limited.
Okay, thank you. And finally, last question, Representative Fleming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been very informative and insightful, which y'all presented. I really put this a lot of, so you say, a lot of meat on the bone, and I really do appreciate that. It seems like, Mr. Crabell, this might be best for you, central governance. What have you seen or experienced in terms of the public as well as the state holding these boards accountable for not meeting the outcomes? Because on your last slide, I think you're spot on to those 3 points. So what could the public and then what can the state help assist JCPS in terms of holding the board accountable to make sure these goals are achieved?
There's two sides of this in my view, from the state perspective, is what are the supports that we can bring to bear that can make a difference, and then what are the accountability mechanisms we can bring to bear. Sometimes you might think of it as carrots and sticks. In terms of what are the supports, a lot of this is a training phenomenon in that boards often are not receiving the training that helps them to clearly be focused on improving student outcomes. Much of the mandatory training that goes on around the country is around legal issues, open meetings laws and public records laws and things of that nature. But very rarely, including in this state, are there requirements that boards actually receive training around being focused on student outcomes, that they receive training around the evidence that does exist in the research literature around what is the behavior that we can engage in that is most correlated with improvements in student outcomes. That is an opportunity that your respective bodies have. And they'd certainly, I think it'd be worth investigating. Is that a direction you want to go? This is not a gap of people not having a heart for the work. It is often a gap of just people not knowing which work is going to make the biggest difference. But that is often a training gap. And so in terms of supports, I would definitely be evaluating what are the ways that we could be a voice for providing supports, providing resources that nudge boards in the direction of getting access to the training that they need that is explicitly focused on the behaviors that improve student outcomes, not on all the legalities, not on all. That is important, that's necessary. But if boards know every legal detail flawlessly, that still isn't going to cause little AJ to be able to read better on Monday morning. And so that distinction is something that you all could take up. On the accountability side of it, most states, again, including here, tend to have very weak focus on how are school boards accountable, and typically a larger focus on how are individual schools or how are school systems accountable. And so I think it's something that you all would have to discuss among yourselves. Do we want to build into our framework something that says, what happens when school boards themselves stumble? That is not a common thing. Very few states across the country have anything like that in their statutes. Again, it's typically focused at what happens when the school stumbles or when the school system stumbles, but not really when the elected officials do. Typically, what my observation is elected officials like to kind of leave the elected officials alone. And so But what that means is that the nature of the accountability is frequently not felt directly by the school board as much as it's felt by the school itself. And so that's just a quick insight into what are some things on the support side that we're seeing around the country, and what are some things on the accountability side that we're seeing.
Okay. Thank you so much. This has been awesome. The really good information. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you very much, and we will follow up with the documents that were requested.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, we have the Office of Educational Accountability, Effectiveness and Efficiency, Kentucky School Districts and School District Governance Models and Interventions. You guys come to the table and please introduce yourselves. Over the past few years, the Office of Education Accountability has conducted several research studies that include the valuable information concerning Jefferson County. We have asked them to present the relevant information from these reports. The full reports are available on the task force's website. Thank you very much, and proceed when you're ready.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Sabrina Cummins, and I work for the Office of Education Accountability.
My name is Allison Stevens, and I work for the Office of Education Accountability.
Deborah Nelson, Division Director, Research, Office of Education Accountability.
Good afternoon. This study reviews school district governance models in Kentucky and all states. It also reports effects of state intervention and other policies that have changed district governance. The study reviews governance laws in Kentucky and the nation, as well as research and media reports. It provides context for understanding local district governance in the Commonwealth. In this presentation, we describe broad similarities and differences between Kentucky and other states. We'll begin by discussing the major findings of the study. Then we will discuss governance structures and state policies and governance changes. Overall, the report finds that Kentucky's laws governing state and local board governance structures are similar to the majority of other states. State policies that have affected governance in other states address concerns such as small district consolidation, district deconsolidations, mayor control, and secession of local communities. And state takeover. Reforms achieve intended outcomes in some cases, but none have proven effective in all cases or comes without challenges. Common challenges include community concerns, implementation technical issues. In this section, we will begin by discussing district governance, followed by a comparison of how Kentucky laws related to school boards compare to those in other states. School board governance creates a framework for how district decisions are made. Governance decisions involve many layers in the district, including organizational leaders and teams. While the superintendent and district administrative teams make key operational decisions on a day-to-day basis, school district governance is directed primarily by the local Board of Education. Research and policy on district governance focus on the local board. The local board is the governing body of the district. It sets policy directions and makes decisions on a wide range of financial, operational, and educational issues. In addition, the board selects the local superintendent who carries out the policies for managing the day-to-day operations. Despite their central role in education, there is little research on best governance models for local boards, and no consensus on best models. Research does highlight general best practices as described in the report. These include common vision, accountability for outcomes, and collaborative relationships. In the next slide, we will compare local board processes in Kentucky to other states. As in Kentucky, local board members in the majority of states are locally elected. In 8 states, board members can be elected or appointed. For example, in some large cities, mayors appoint some or all board members. As in half of the other states, the terms set for local board members in Kentucky is up to 4 years. In other states, terms range from a low of 3 to a high of 6 years. In most states, as in Kentucky, the number of local school board members varies by district type. In Kentucky, local boards have 5 members. However, Jefferson County has 7. In other states, variation in the number of board members by district can be based on the size or type of districts. Appendix E of the report shows laws for all 50 states. The next slide will compare the number of local board members to similar sized districts as Jefferson County. Jefferson County has 7 local school board members, which is similar to other districts of similar size. One district, San Diego, only has 5, while the remaining 4 districts have 9 board members, 2 more than Jefferson County. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Allison, who will discuss state policies related to governance concerns.
Thank you, Sabrina. We will focus on governance concerns related to large districts, but the full report describes those related to small districts. We would be happy to discuss those in the question period. Policies that address governance concerns related to large districts fall into 2 broad categories: those that address district size and those that address board authority. I'll begin with those that address district size. But first, I will describe some of the concerns that led to these policy efforts. Some stakeholders believe that large districts are not responsive to the needs of individual students or families, that large districts are inefficient, or that the local board does not sufficiently represent all stakeholders. Critics of large districts have also claimed that board elections are more likely to be influenced by organized special interest groups, such as teachers' unions, than elections in smaller districts. Large districts also tend to have lower academic achievement than the state in which they are located, raising concerns about district effectiveness. The cause of urban districts' relatively lower performance is difficult to isolate. It could reflect practices typical of urban districts or the student population within large districts. As noted in the report, one study suggests that, on average, large city schools may not be performing below the rest of the students tested in state NAEP data, given their student populations. That's the Mirrors and Windows report that was just discussed. In particular, the study determined that JCPS was achieving about what you would expect, given its student population. I will now describe policy efforts relevant to concerns about large districts, beginning with those that address size. Lawmakers in other states have proposed bills to deconsolidate large districts or to study deconsolidation. For example, in Clark County, Nevada, deconsolidation efforts have been ongoing since 1997. The most recent legislative action, in 2017, focused on increasing local decision-making related to budgets and staffing within Clark County. Disputes and challenges related to implementation of that legislation have been ongoing. In Omaha, legislation mandating deconsolidation passed in 2006 but was later repealed. In New Mexico, a large district deconsolidation bill was introduced but did not pass. In North Carolina, a joint committee studied deconsolidation, but no legislation was passed. OEA is not aware of any deconsolidation efforts that have been finalized into law. Analysis of state legislation described on the previous slide highlights a variety of issues that were considered, most of which were logistical, such as district boundaries, property value disparities, taxing authority, state and local funding, capital costs, and division of assets, and others were possible segregation issues and specialty school status. However, there have been many cases of smaller communities that have seceded from the larger district in which they are located. We know of one example, Memphis Shelby County Public Schools, in which these smaller communities were located in a very large district, but most cases of secession have happened in relatively smaller districts. Over half of states have laws that allow individual communities to secede from the larger district in which they are located. Kentucky does not. Secession laws vary in permissiveness. For example, Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee only require voters in the seceding district to approve it, whereas most other states require approval from voters in the district left behind, the state, or both. Since 2000, roughly 40 districts have seceded, and nearly as many have tried and failed. Gardendale, Alabama, for example, failed to secede due in part to a court ruling that its effort had a discriminatory intent. Secession of districts has been concentrated in a minority of states, and advocates believe that secession creates smaller districts that may be more responsive to local needs, but critics note that secession has often resulted in more racially and economically segregated districts. As the report notes, secession does not necessarily affect segregation among schools. Now we will look at policies that change board authority, beginning with mayoral control. Mayoral control became popular in the 1990s as a way of addressing concerns about student achievement, lack of board accountability, and inefficiencies in large city school districts. Proponents believe that mayors are more accountable to the public than our local boards and are better able to address low student achievement and inefficiency in district operations. A comprehensive report recently completed for the governor and the legislature of New York noted that research on the effects of mayoral control is inconclusive. Student achievement improved in some mayorally controlled districts, but these improvements were not always consistent across grade levels, sustained over time, or effective at reducing achievement gaps. In addition, local communities were often upset with mayoral actions, such as school closures. Mayoral control is currently in place in 9 states and 11 large cities, including New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C., but has been phased out in many cities, including Los Angeles and Detroit, and most recently, Chicago. Lastly, I will discuss state takeovers of local districts. State takeovers are independent of district size, although districts that are taken over as a group tend to be larger. State takeovers occur when a state Department of Education acts on its legal authority to remove decision-making functions and authority from local leaders and transfer it to individuals or entities that can include state officials, mayors, a receiver, or a management organization. As of 2021, 34 states, including Kentucky, had laws permitting state takeovers. Most state takeovers are initiated for financial reasons, and about half are for academic reasons. Other reasons include mismanagement or noncompliance. Research analyzing many years of state takeover across the nation shows that, on average, state takeovers may improve some aspects of district financial health. Researchers hypothesize that improvements may be associated, in part, with state bailout funding. It is unclear whether state takeovers increased districts' fiscal efficiency. State takeovers are not associated with increased academic performance. While student achievement improved after state takeovers in some districts, it declined or did not change in others. The full report provides case studies of the state takeover currently being undertaken in Houston, Tennessee's efforts to take over management of low-performing schools, and the state takeover that occurred in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, also cited as an example of the portfolio model of district governance described in the report. Academic effects vary among these districts, though they have experienced some common challenges, including teacher protests, community concerns, and some lawsuits. This concludes our presentation, and we will be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Our first question is from Representative Bojanowski.
All right, so actually, I'm going to hold my question. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Mrs. Abdelahad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry. My question is with respect to slide 10, the large district local board of education membership. Sorry, that was a mouthful. I was wondering, I see two notable districts missing from here, and I know it's not an extensive list, but Charlotte and Jacksonville are often peer cities that are compared to JCPS, either like by the Council of Great City Schools or by JCPS themselves. So I was curious sort of how this list was comprised and why those two might have been left off.
Isn't it 7,000 or 10,000?
I looked at the districts with population within, I think, 25% of Jefferson County. I forget what that exact high and low range was at the moment, but it was a little bit tight. I think it was 25%. It may have been 20%, but we picked a tight range around Jefferson County.
Okay. Thank you. I think in some of my research independently that they're doing the exact same thing, that Charlotte had a larger, like a 9-seat board too. So I was just sort of curious about that. So I'll look at the percentage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Seeing no further questions, I really appreciate you guys being here today.
Thank you.
And go ahead and proceed with your second presentation.
Good afternoon.
I know.
Sorry. I apologize.
Ready?
Yes.
Let's go.
Okay. This section of our presentation will summarize findings from 2 OEA studies as they may be relevant to understanding some spending and achievement data in JCPS. The first was published last year and looked at factors associated with spending and with student achievement in Kentucky districts, taking student demographic characteristics into account. The second is a recently approved follow-up study that analyzed school-level data. Data shown in this presentation are taken from these 2 reports. The second includes site visits to a variety of schools across the Commonwealth. As noted in the presentation, we have also included some more recent data from OEA's 2023 district data profiles and a few data points which are publicly accessible on the KDE website. Presentation will review findings related to spending, barriers to achievement in lowest impact schools, and lowest impact schools are those that are performing far below similar students across the state. And some JCPS data relevant to the barriers we identify. We'll begin by looking at spending. This figure shows district per pupil expenditures, which increase from left to right along the bottom horizontal axis against the percent of students in a district who are considered to be living in poverty, which increases from the bottom to the top of the figure. The line across the middle divides districts that are above and below the average percentage of students in poverty across all districts. District membership is shown by the size of each bubble. It's easy to spot JCPS, which is the largest district in the state and is slightly above average in the percent of students in poverty. We'll focus on a few features of the data shown in the figure. First, as district per pupil spending increases from left to right, so does the proportion of districts that exceed the state average for students in poverty. Also, you'll notice that there are relatively few very small districts among the lowest spending on the left, whereas many of the highest spending districts on the right are small. And notice these here up at the top. Okay. This figure shows 2023 per pupil revenue by source for the state, which the state data includes JCPS also, and for JCPS alone. It shows that JCPS receives relatively less in state per pupil revenue than the state as a whole, but far exceeds the state in per pupil revenue from local funding sources. Much of JCPS local revenue comes from higher property assessments and occupational taxes. Economists have identified 4 factors that increase the cost necessary to educate students and are beyond school or district administrators' control. These are small district size and geographic dispersion, neither of which apply to Jefferson County, and higher cost labor markets and higher need student populations, which do. This map shows differences among Kentucky districts in the competitiveness of local labor markets as determined by the Comparable Wage Index for Teachers, or CWIFT, which is an indicator developed by the National Center for Education Statistics based on wages of college graduates who are not teachers. As you can see by its dark gray color, JCPS is among the highest cost labor markets in the state. As the committee has seen in previous presentations, compared with the state, JCPS has higher percentages of students considered high need because they may be living in poverty, as indicated by eligibility for free or reduced price lunch, and have limited English proficiency. In the last decade, increases in the percentage of LEP and Hispanic students in JCPS have outpaced the state. The difference shown on this slide does not reveal the level of challenge associated with student poverty in many JCPS schools, and this is what you were hearing earlier related to abject poverty. This is because percentages of students in poverty vary greatly within the district, which has a range from the lowest to the highest poverty schools in the state. As we'll show later in this presentation, students living in poverty are especially concentrated in about half of the district's schools. We'll move now to look at 2 barriers to achievement in lowest impact districts across the state: teacher turnover and teacher working conditions, especially climate, culture, and student behavior. I'll note here that the issues we focus on could also be described as student working conditions. While this presentation shows teacher survey data, the full report shows very similar trends with survey data collected from all students tested each year. But first, I'll briefly explain how OEA identified highest and lowest impact schools. Highest impact schools are those that far exceed a statistically predicted score for the school. OEA identified 175 schools in that category, or about 14% of schools in the state. Lowest impact schools are those that fall far below that predicted score. Those were also 14% of schools in the state. And related to these lowest impact schools, I'd like to pause here to really emphasize that while the remainder of this presentation will focus on characteristics of these schools as a group, they vary among each other in terms of the state data that we're going to present and also based on what we saw in site visit schools. Nothing you hear in this presentation should suggest that conclusions can be drawn about the characteristics of leaders, teachers, or systems in these schools based on publicly reported data alone. The report does not identify schools, particular schools, or districts. This is because, as described in the report, the methodology that we use has some limitations that may apply more to some schools and districts than others. The statistical model used to generate a predicted score takes into account a variety of student and community characteristics known to be associated with academic performance, such as eligibility for free or reduced price lunch, limited English proficiency or special education services, race or ethnicity, whether a student was homeless, and whether a student moved schools during the school year, the education level of the community, and whether a student attends a high poverty school. We'll move now to look at key differences between the highest and lowest impact schools, and we'll begin with teacher turnover. And here, let me note that we are limited when we talk about differences among these schools to the type of data that you can collect at the state level. So if there were other measures, Representative Bojanowski, you referred to this, we are really limited in comparing these schools in the type of data that we collect. So that's a limitation of the study. Teacher turnover in lowest impact schools was an average of 21%, which is 1.4 times higher than the average turnover of 15% in highest impact schools. Principal turnover is also greater in lowest impact schools. Principals in highest impact schools had been in their positions an average of 6 years, which is 1.5 times greater than the average of 4 years in lowest impact schools. This slide shows a percent of highest and lowest impact schools that have very high turnover rates. It shows that more than a third of lowest impact schools, shown on the right, have very high teacher turnover rates, which are about 25% turnover. As shown on the left, high teacher turnover rates are very rare in highest impact schools. The report discusses the critical importance of teacher and principal longevity in building the instructional and behavioral systems found in highest impact schools. Some factors affecting teacher turnover are outside of district's control. In Jefferson County, for example, lower performing schools are in relatively close physical proximity to higher performing schools, in which national research suggests teachers generally prefer to work. However, research suggests that teacher turnover can be influenced by the actions of local leaders to create favorable working conditions. As you'll see in the next series of slides, working conditions are also associated with student achievement. Teachers in highest impact schools report more favorable working conditions than those in lowest impact schools. In other words, students from all demographic groups are much more likely to learn in schools where teachers like to work. And I'll just remind you, when we say higher impact schools, that group included some of the highest poverty schools in the state. Very high percentages of all the student groups that normally perform below average are performing above average in these schools. And so this is a group that represents all demographic groups. Data in the next few slides are based on teachers' responses to a working conditions survey given every 2 years by the Kentucky Department of Education. OEA categorized schools as having more or less favorable working conditions based on the percentage of favorable responses to the over 70 questions on the survey. As shown on the right, the majority of lowest impact schools had relatively less favorable conditions, as indicated by the dark gray bar. On the left, you can see that the majority of highest impact schools had more favorable conditions, as shown in the light gray bar. The next slide shows the topics covered by the survey. These topics, each of which contain multiple questions, are arranged from top to bottom in order of areas that separated teachers most in the highest and lowest impact schools. Teachers differed most on questions related to student behavior and school climate. However, highest impact schools were greater in all topic areas. Out of all the over 70 questions on the survey, these are the individual questions that distinguish teachers in highest and lowest schools the most. They suggest strongly that relationships and orderly classroom environments provide a critical foundation for learning. Teachers in highest impact schools were much more likely to respond favorably about supportive interactions among students, how often student misconduct disrupts learning, and student enthusiasm about being at school. And here I'll note that that question about student misconduct is sandwiched between two questions that have to do with relationships. And this is something that we heard very much from teachers and principals in highest impact schools. Again, these are schools of all types of students, that the building the positive relationships with students is the foundation of school discipline. Next highest distinguishing questions were related to how often students help each other, respectful relationships between teachers and students, and effectiveness of school leaders at developing rules. Again, these questions suggest that climate, culture, and behavior provide a critical foundation for learning. And again, I'll note that the full report shows similar themes in student survey data. So the issues addressed on these slides are working conditions that appear to affect both teachers and students. Teachers in lowest impact schools visited for the study described the following challenges related to behavior. They noted that a small percentage of students can destabilize a school or classroom, that there is often little or no consequence for serious disruptive behavior of some students. In one school, teachers reported low morale, teacher absences, and substitutes refusing to work in the building. And some mentioned challenges associated with limitations on the number of times that classroom special education students can be removed from the classroom. The full report goes into great detail on the role of principals and other leaders in affecting almost every area of school life. For example, in the instructional systems that were a focus of the report, though not of this presentation. And related to the data shown on the previous slide, effective principal leadership is critical in developing and supporting behavioral systems. A distinguishing feature of principals in highest impact schools we visited is that they focused on the responsibilities of all staff to build positive relationships, invested time and resources in establishing expectations for the whole school, and addressed persistent behavior challenges. And as we note in the report, sometimes this required political will on their part to confront parents, district administrators, and sometimes even the local school board. In addition, the report describes the strong effect that principals can have, both positive and negative, on teacher recruitment and retention. Highest impact site visit schools were desired destinations for job seekers, and teachers in many of these schools reported reluctance ever to leave the school, even for a higher salary. This quote from a teacher in a highest impact school illustrates the point. The principal is someone that we would follow into the fire. This is a very high poverty school, by the way. We would fight bears for her. We love her. She's right there with us. She supports us in everything we do. All my life, I've been looking for this place. This is the place I wouldn't have fallen through the cracks. I'm so glad I'm here. The principal knows what each student may do and how to keep them on the right track. She knows about their lives. It's like we're part of something here. In this quote, you can hear again the strong influence of the principal on the working conditions of the school and the well-being and success of both teachers and students in the school. We'll close with some data relevant to the barriers identified in the report as they apply to Jefferson County. Oh, sorry. As noted on a previous slide, lowest impact schools had an average of 21% teacher turnover. The report does not provide school-level teacher turnover for JCPS in particular, but it does provide teacher turnover data on highest poverty schools and schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement. CSI schools are the state's lowest performing schools. Teacher turnover in highest poverty and CSI schools is at or usually above that 21% for lowest impact schools generally. As you'll see on the next few slides, JCPS has many high poverty and CSI schools. Research shows that the effects of poverty on student achievement are greater in schools with very high percentages of students in lower achieving groups. As shown on this slide, over half, 55% of JCPS schools are higher poverty schools. This is 2.5 times greater than the percentage of schools in the rest of the state that are highest poverty. Compared with the state, JCPS also has many schools with higher percentages of students who are LEP, Black, or Hispanic. In the 2022 or 2023 school years, 34 or about 1/4 of JCPS schools were CSI schools. The report shows that in addition to high turnover rates, CSI schools have much higher percentages of students who move during the school year compared with other schools in the state. High poverty rates and high student mobility rates are really baseline challenges for many schools within the district. As shown in Appendix E of the 2024 report, many CSI schools are not actually in the lowest impact category after demographics are considered. Yet they shared similar challenges. We'll conclude with this slide, which shows differences between favorability ratings of respondents in JCPS and the state on the working conditions survey discussed earlier. JCPS favorable ratings in the topic areas highlighted were similar to those for lowest impact schools shown earlier. Note also that JCPS favorability ratings related to educating all students exceeded the state and were also higher than those reported for highest impact schools. Our full report suggests that teacher turnover, school climate, and culture and student behavior have relatively less focus in state school improvement efforts than instructional reforms, and that absent attention to these barriers, benefits of instructional reforms may not be sustained. I'll note here that OEA did not analyze JCPS district improvement efforts for this study, but we are aware that the district has recently put substantial resources toward attempting to retain teachers in the highest need schools. Any effects of this effort would not yet be evident in the years of data analyzed for this report. And finally, the report includes a number of recommendations for increasing attention to the barriers we identified. For example, it recommended that when CSI schools are identified next year, KDE provide districts with options for turnaround assistance that can address these challenges. This concludes the presentation, and we'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. We have one question, Representative Bojanowski.
Okay, so I do actually have a question this time. All right, I want to go back to the discussion, because we discussed this last week, about the CSI schools that, so you've got accountability scores and you have impact scores, and they're different numbers. So in the lowest accountability, our schools are not necessarily the lowest in impact. And I think what we know is true as educators is that there is a lot of good work going on in our most struggling schools. And sometimes that doesn't just get measured by accountability scores. Could you speak just a little bit about that discrepancy between being a lowest accountability score, but I mean, 83% of the high schools were not in the lowest impact score level?
Right.
If you would.
Speak to the discrepancy?
Yeah, just speak
in the scores.
Yes.
So the cause of the discrepancy in the scores is the reason that when we're looking for best practices, we don't just look at raw achievement data. As you know, if you pull up the highest performing schools in the state, and we have the data in the report, they're going to be almost all low poverty schools. There's a small sliver of highest poverty schools in that high performing category. And so when you look at schools that way, you don't know whether there's something that that is amazing that's happening in the schools, or whether it's the characteristics of students. Similarly, if you look at the lowest performing schools, most of them are higher poverty schools. We have visited those schools, those types of schools, many times in our site visits, and some of them are the most impressive schools that I've seen in terms of the efforts that are being made. And so what's difficult is that you'll have some schools that are doing really wonderful things for children that are not reflected in scores. And when we cite the data about teachers leaving low-performing schools in our site visits over the years, we have heard frequently that a reason for teachers leaving is that they feel that they're working hard, they feel they're doing the best thing for children, but they're being judged as ineffective in the press and other. So that's why when we look for effective practices, we adjust for performance. So in our highest impact category, we visited a school that had almost 100% of the students were living in poverty. More than a third were English language learners. Almost all of the students were from minority groups that are typically lower performing, and this school was performing above average. So these are the schools that we visited in the highest impact category for exactly the reason that you describe. And then, as you note, and as we note in the report, in all states, if you look in all states, which are the lowest performing schools, the CSI schools, they are the highest poverty schools. They are the schools with the highest percentage of Black or Hispanic students. They're located in all states across the nation. It's disproportionate. And there it's really hard to separate out. Is there something ineffective happening in the school, or is it the student population? So that's why when we were looking at characteristics of schools, we have a model that separates out student demographics. And I just will emphasize that in that group of highest impact schools are among the highest poverty schools in the state. We also talk about higher impact districts. So we visited a district that looks good by even, it's above average, but when you adjust for its student demographics, it's the highest in the state. And that's not an accident when you get to the district and you see what's going on for the students. So very much the reason we adopted the methodology that we did is for the reason that you cite. And I will also say, though, that when you look at the data for the teacher working conditions survey, just know that there are schools that are serving students with some, that would be demographically among the greatest challenges, where the teachers are on fire. And then the student climate survey also would support that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Have a great evening. And if Mr. Paul Pastoric, founder of Civic Solutions Group, could come forward to provide the task force with an outside view. We've invited Mr. Pastoric with the Civic Solutions Group to share some thoughts about addressing district effectiveness. And when you're ready, please introduce yourself for the record, and you may begin.
All right. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Great. My name is Paul Pastorek. I'm from the city of New Orleans, and I was very interested to listen to the last presentation, which talked about the state takeover. I was superintendent after Hurricane Katrina and was part of that entire process. And I will tell you that the schools in the city of New Orleans are far better for the experience. By the way, the state takeover was ended, and all schools will return to the local school board. I also know A.J. Craybill, who presented with the Council of Great City Schools very well. He mentioned a study that was done where some boards and districts were coached and trained, and that the results were far better than if only trained or not trained at all. I actually, and our firm actually works in that program. It's called System of Great Schools. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but our firm actually coaches and trains districts and boards around this. And I think so. It was kind of poetic that I'm interested in both of the previous presentations. They were very good, and I thought I really liked the presentation about the high impact schools, which are also high poverty. I'll explain why in a moment. I have been creating, supporting, or advocating for better learning environments for all children for about 40 years now. But I will say that I have a particular passion for the learning environments for students who are economically disadvantaged. This is where I have spent my time because these children are unable to afford fine schools and are often left to attend the low-performing neighborhood school. Many are unable to read proficiently by the 4th grade level, and by the time they get there and are unable, they are on a trajectory for failure. And I have seen this, and I've even discussed this with the penitentiary people in Louisiana, and they talk about how people figure the size of jails based on the number of students who are not proficient at this grade level. This, to me, is an urgent and important issue for all of our states to address. And I and our little firm have been working on this for a number of years after I left the superintendent job in 2011. I have been a lawyer for most of my life, but I have transitioned all of that over to being a lawyer for kids. My main focus is being an advocate, especially for these children. Some people, everyone knows that there's a correlation between students who are poor and negative outcomes. I get, frankly, frustrated because people begin to believe that there's some causal relationship. There is no causal relationship. Poor children who live in disadvantaged circumstances certainly present differently than other children, but they can be educated to proficient levels. And they are, in fact, educated to proficient levels in a number of circumstances. And I think even here. I'm going to talk today about the urban school district challenges, the role of the state, and the role of the board, how similarly situated districts, and this is really how I got here. I was asked to present about how other districts are being successful at dealing with their low-achieving schools, and particularly with their poor children in low-achieving schools. And then to identify levers to support high performance in urban school districts. Now, the objectives, and you've all seen this presentation, I know, earlier, so I won't read what's on here, but these are the objectives that districts are trying to achieve. And these are, in my opinion, the challenges to those objectives. And I want to emphasize two for purposes of today's discussion. Number one is the systems, processes, or regulations which do not support success, or the obverse, the lack of systems to support success. There was a very noted professor and consultant, Edward Deming, who put forth a proposition that most of the cause of problems with businesses are system related, not people related. In fact, he came up with the so-called 94-6 rule. 94% of problems associated with outcomes in business circumstances are related to improper systems, and people are working in those systems and can't execute. I believe that proposition works in the education domain as well. When systems are not designed to do the work, you're going to get bad outcomes. And I don't blame the teachers in the building when they're operating with the system they've been given. Now, there are certainly some, and Deming would argue that there are some issues with the people, but that's not really the big issue. So how do systems need to change? And then the second thing I would like to mention on the political will side, I have worked with lots of superintendents, state superintendents, district superintendents around the country, and I asked one the other day who ran a large district that was trying to move out of and did improve academic outcomes for its low-achieving schools and poor children. I said, what do you attribute success to? And his response was, the courage to be unpopular and take a regular beating while remaining steadfast in both our goals and strategies. So it takes political will to change education systems because they are very resistant to change. Now, I want to talk about outliers, favorable outliers. And the KDE presented a little bit ago about high impact schools that have high populations of poor children. When I became superintendent, let me get some water here. When I became superintendent in Louisiana, someone told me it's not really possible to get poor children to proficiency levels. He was actually an educator at the Louisiana State University. And I was absolutely shocked. And I said, I believe it is. And he said, prove it. And I couldn't, at the moment, prove it. I went back to the department and I said, are there schools where kids are proficient and poor and minority schools? And the answer was yes. In the entire state of Louisiana, out of 1,300 schools, there were about 20 of them. And I was like, wow, this is special. We need to take a look at what's happening here and see. And I actually went and met with a principal, and I marveled at the statement that the teacher gave to the KDE, which was read to you just a few moments ago. It described the principal that I met, and I asked her, how is it that you are this favorable outlier? You are succeeding where people believe you can't. And her answer was, we have an intense belief these children can learn. We have an intense belief these children can learn. We have a belief, it's an intense one, that these children can learn. She said it to me over again. And we have a system that we're using that the district doesn't approve. And it works. And guess what? The district doesn't bother us. Sometimes the system is overwhelming to people because the system doesn't work for these schools, and people have to put the political will in to overcome that. And that is what this principal did. Now, here's some good news. Good news is, in some very simple analysis that we did of schools in Jefferson County, we took the accountability results and grouped them by children who are or schools that have a population of poor children that are greater than the district average, and that's what you're seeing on the screen. And here in rating 3, which is your middle rating at the state level, the total rating of the school, You have 15 schools. One is magnet. Okay, well, that's an advantage. But the other 14 schools are not, and they're performing in the third rating. This is really good news. What's even better news is 2 are performing in rating 4. The question is, why are there so many other schools in ratings 1 and 2? What is it that's happening in ratings 3 and 4 in these 17 schools? And how can you use that to good advantage? So it's just like the presentation that KDE made a little bit ago, identifying schools around the state. Well, here are schools in the district. And what we did in Louisiana when I was superintendent is we began to study what's going on, and we began to propagate those ideas. And by the time I left the Department of Education, we had 60 schools that were high poverty, high performing, we called them. Now, in looking at the rest of the schools, the non-high poverty schools, it was interesting also to see, these are the ones in purple, that there are a number in the 4 and 5 rating categories, but in 15 and even 4 in the ratings 2 and 3 category. And this seems to me to be yet an opportunity to work on these schools. And what you'll see when I talk in a moment about system of great schools is the object of the exercise in Texas is to get all of the schools out of your rating 1 and 2 schools and move them into rating 4 and 5. And they have a model for doing it, and it's a model that I've worked with a great deal. So when I look at Jefferson County Public Schools, this to me would be the most important document. If everyone agreed that that Paul did this right and did the numbers right, I think we did. I think the object of the exercise for Jefferson County Public Schools is moving all of those schools from categories ratings 1 and 2 into 4 and 5. And the question then becomes how to do it. Now, we've heard a lot about the role of the state and the role of the district, and I've given you a chart on this. It's pretty standard stuff. I won't bore you with it, but I did want to talk about this slide, that when you have a district that is challenged, and perhaps Jefferson County District is, if you look at these data, the state gets involved. And we heard earlier from the KDE about the state getting involved and what some of those opportunities may be. I think that there are many opportunities, and I've outlined them later in the presentation, but I want to talk about this in looking at the second bullet, state accountability. The state can direct action and say, do this, or the state can say, in number 3, if you do this, we will give you resources. These are, to me, the very simple way of how the state can deal with this. What could the state direct? What could the state incentivize a district to do? Now, let me look at how other school districts have faced these challenges. And I'll start with the common traits. And I will say that, number 1, it's a belief. It's a belief. Number 2, there need to be consequences for outcomes. Now, I looked at a very long document yesterday. It's the Comprehensive District Plan, Implementation Plan for what the school district should do, prepared by an outside firm, the same firm that did the, I think, Cognia, the same firm that did the study in 2022 about some of the challenges in, particularly in academics and instruction, curriculum instruction. And in this district implementation plan, more than 100 pages long, there were many activities that are set out. many activities, and they're good. I thought they were very good. The question is, what happens when these activities are not achieved? What happens? What are the consequences? And I think when you look at school districts that do well or schools that do well, there are accountability, rewards, and consequences, and it's very important to keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to go through some examples here. Denver is a remarkable experiment, if you will. It's basically a significant number of charter schools were chartered by the district, and they also were very involved in closing low-performing schools and reassigning students to better schools. And the findings of this University of Colorado report demonstrate that there was very positive outcomes. I think learning gains as high as 27 months for students. Now, there's been criticism of this report, but I think in the main, I think the outcome here, no one disputes that the gains in Denver, the academic achievement gains, were dramatic. The real argument with the scientists is around why. In Fort Worth, there is a remarkable effort underway. In fact, today they're making a presentation about a 7-school zone that they've created within Fort Worth. It's a very large district, but they've taken a feeder pattern and they've put it in something called ACE. ACE is the Accelerating Campus Excellence Initiative. This has proven and I've given you a bunch of slides in the appendix to show you the outcomes over the last 6 years using this ACE model. And I want to just mention what the elements of it are. Number one, strategic staffing. Teachers are paid extra stipends annually for a period of 3 years to reconstitute the campus. So people are incentivized to come to the campus. Instructional excellence based on data-driven instruction and early intervention. Response to intervention is very strong in these schools. Extending the school day and offering after-school enrichment and catch-up for students, depending on where they fall. Social and emotional learning supports for students and training for educators, and strong partnerships with parent and community organizations. I have to tell you that I'm working with another district in Louisiana, and they adopted the ACE model for 2 of its lowest performing schools, which are almost all black and all poor. They brought in some of the best and brightest teachers by paying this stipend. And it's just started in the summer. They put these 2 schools together. The superintendent has seen the amount of discipline issues drop dramatically in these 2 elementary schools. He sees teaching and learning going on every day. They did an assessment at the beginning of the year of these students. 2nd graders were not able to sound out letters and were not able to identify numbers. Now, when kids get to the 2nd grade and they're in that kind of situation, you have to make dramatic changes to the way you're teaching and instructing students. And that is what ACE does, and the outcomes, again, in Fort Worth after several years demonstrate that these strategies that I outlined are very profound. There are some other ones that I will mention briefly. there is the empowerment zone partnership. You talk about whether there should be top-down management or up to the top management of schools, whether it's local school-based decision-making and so forth. School-based decision-making is great as long as it doesn't affect the model badly that you're trying to adopt. And I know you made some changes in the law to allow for district-wide curriculum, which is very good because of the mobility issues you just heard about in Jefferson County. When a kid leaves one school and goes to another school in Jefferson County, you need to be relatively in the same place so the kid can be able to make the transition. But the empowerment zone takes a different view, and schools are given wide latitude, but very careful boundaries and checks and balances. And I've been to Springfield to see this a few years ago, and it's very powerful. It's a contract between the union with the school board and a provider that is doing the underlying work. These are for middle schools and high schools. And while there are still lots of work to go, there are some really impressive gains that they've accomplished. Charlotte Mecklenburg, some years ago, did this strategy where they brought in a top flight principal, and he or she was allowed to select their team of about 7, which could be administrators or teachers or faculty. And this one has been evaluated, and this has worked in Charlotte Mecklenburg, and it's actually not too dissimilar from the ACE model. It also involves extending the day. Springfield involves extending the day and the year in Springfield. And then the TAP system, which we had in Louisiana, and it's in many states in the country, and it's a really amazing system. It really incorporates professional learning communities in a very deep way, and in fact, all of these do that I've mentioned, but the professional learning communities, it's a pay-for-performance model. You don't pay them more up front, but you pay them for performance along the way. And you're also dealing with extended day. Now, I want to get to 2 case studies which I think are exceedingly important, because I think these are much more scalable when you look at the ACE model or the TAP model or the empowerment zone. They're for smaller aspects of the district. And I think they could work in Jefferson County if people wanted to try them out. But on a larger scale, I would point to these 2 that are going on. One is relatively nascent. The other has been underway for several years. That's SGS. The System of Great Schools has been underway for 7 years. And it is a volunteer process where districts volunteer, but they are given special status to be able to receive grants to be able to deal with challenged schools. In the NES, which is where Texas took over the district in Houston, the Houston Independent School District, and appointed a board of managers there, appointed a superintendent, and the superintendent has come in with a very powerful approach. It's very heavily supported curriculum and instruction model, and it's I think a pretty important one to pay attention to. In the System of Great Schools, there are 25 school districts in Texas, and there's new ones just coming on. We're just starting to work with the District of El Paso right now, and we've worked with a number of these other ones as well. Over the years, presently, Texas is enjoined from publishing its school report scores because of disputes. But through 2022, there's been a significant increase in the number of campuses that have become AB. And that's the whole point, is to get more AB campuses. They have a letter grade system, A, B, C, D, F. You have a number system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Their number 1 is equal to their F, 2, D, 3, C, and so forth. Their object is to get their D and F schools out, and they have tremendous pressure by the state to do that. But these districts are volunteering and using state models to be able to determine how to do that. More students have moved to AB schools, and more schools have been rated AB. 100,000 more students over this period of 3 years have moved into AB school districts among the various ones. These are the strategies that they use. I think probably the most important are 1 and 2, although we could spend a long time talking about this. But developing a North Star goal, and this little chart shows and demonstrates a North Star goal, setting a goal in 5 years of what student proficiency should be, and most districts adopt an 80% student proficiency goal. But not only do they set a goal far in the future, but they set interim goals so that there is accountability each year, not just at the end of 5 years when the superintendent is gone and the new superintendent has come in and decided to do something different. And this is the essential part of this. This is a school management system. You're managing the outcome of schools, and you are determining how to assess those schools over the course of a year. And then you are taking actions with respect to those schools. So this is not a curriculum and instruction model. This is if a school doesn't do well, what are the consequences we're going to take? And in this case, there are 4 consequences that they must consider as a system of grade school. And some of these you've heard about and know about, but they are obligated to move a school that's in the F or D category into one of these school actions so as to improve. And you saw the results I mentioned earlier. The second one I want to go to now is the Houston Independent School District. This one is a heavy curriculum and instruction model as opposed to managing the student outcomes as a system of great schools. This curriculum and instruction model was applied in year 1, which just completed, to a zone of schools, 84 schools. Houston has about 250 schools. And they took a set of schools, their CSI schools, and other schools that volunteered to be in this program, and they then applied this curriculum and instruction model, which I went to see in February how this actually works. And it is really the most impressive and intense work at curriculum and instruction and supporting teachers and giving them guidance and giving them feedback so that they're able to deliver. I want to stress that teachers are paid more in these schools, and there is a tremendous amount of extra learning time. They have block scheduling, and in the first part of the block, all students are being taught together. In the second part of the block, kids who are moving at a more rapid rate are going to extra work, and the students who are going at a slower rate stay in the class and continue to get intervention type training. And then they've extended the school day as well. The results are rather substantial. 80% of the schools saw improvement in state accountability, while 7% of the 84 schools decreased and 13% remained the same. Now, the lowest performing schools, or the equivalent of the CSI schools, in the F category plus the D category, 92% saw improvement. I think the other notable aspect of this is teacher retention. There is a strong evaluation component in this model, and teachers who are evaluated well or highly retain highly. Teachers who were not evaluated well were not. So you have a strong teacher retention result, and discipline incidences, I've had other reports, but I don't have them with me today, are down significantly. Now, I'm not going to go through the levers to support high performance in urban school districts, but I've tried to outline for you, based on all of the different experiences that I've had and working with schools that have been able to be successful, what types of things ought to be considered in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. These are things the state could do in order to address some of the opportunities to address the Category 1 and Category 2 schools that you have in Jefferson County. I'd like to close by just making this comment. I often said when I was state superintendent that kids don't have time for adults to get their act together. Every year that schools are performing in a DF category or a 1-2 category are fatal to children. To me, when I see schools in a DF category, I see this as a 5-alarm fire. And I believe that we collectively as a community, as a nation, and I'm very interested in this locality, that we see to it that we make the most immediate efforts to address these challenges as promptly as possible. And I've given you some examples about how that may be done, and I believe there's probably other examples too. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much. Very good presentation. We have one question. Representative Bogajanowski.
Yes, I have a very brief request and then a question, if I can just combine them into.
Certainly.
Okay, so the slides on favorable outliers and other opportunities, could you give us a list of those schools that you put into the favorable category and the exact way that you measured that, if you could? And you could just send that to us.
Oh, sure. Happy to do that.
So I did a quick look at the ACE program, and from what I could read, it's about $1 million per school building. And in my building, I'm a special ed teacher in Jefferson County. We could then maybe have an interventionist who could work with the second grade students who can't decode yet, rather than having to cover classes that don't have substitute. You know, there are limits to what resources we have. And there's also a tension in elementary school even that the students need to perform on the tests. So sometimes I sort of call it the world according to Tina. If I were to be in charge, I would make sure every child had intensive reading instruction 2-3 hours a day until they can read. But your tension is that we are measured on test scores and they have to be exposed to the content. And so that accountability push keeps sometimes what I think logically would be the highest priorities. So I also, I'm going to say this carefully, take offense to the inference that we who are working with those lowest performing students don't believe that the world's on fire and that everything needs to change. Because I got to tell you, I spend countless hours preparing for my students and doing what they had to have done. And that isn't reflected in their data. And so as an educator, I just am sharing how difficult it is for statements to be made as if we as educators don't care about our students and do not professionally do what we need to do to move them forward.
Well, let me say, I don't wish to disrespect, and I think if you go back to my earlier comments, I said that the system is the big issue here. It's not the people. I have met people like you in schools who are working themselves as hard as possible. And I have said to them, you're working in a system that doesn't allow you to really be successful. So my comments about the concern over the schools is a concern for those children, but it's not an indictment of the teachers. It's focusing on the system. And so to your point about money and resources, one of the aspects of the system of great schools is when you go to a school, you are given extra resources. It's the same for the A schools. In fact, the A schools in Fort Worth are provided resources by the state because they have created, in that case, a charter with Wesleyan University, and they are working to get out of that situation. You know, my biggest challenge, I was the state accountability officer, and I respect the attention that you just described. My biggest frustration is, to be perfectly honest, is seeing teachers like you who are in a system that's not successful, and you are working as hard as you can. And I feel for you. I feel for all of those teachers. I really do. And that's why I try to work so hard at creating better systems so that you and others can be successful. Because at the end of the day, it's the kids that we're all focused on. Everyone is. This commission, this task force wouldn't be here if you and I were not interested in the ultimate objective. Look, I respect you and what you do, especially a special ed teacher. That's the hardest job, I think, in a school building. So, but you need to have that interventionist. You need to have additional resources in these schools. And I think if a model is adopted that's a proven model and the state or the district applies resources to that, you will see progress for a change. And I think that's what you want. I know that's what I want. And I think that's what we all want.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Wertenberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the presentation, great information. This whole day, I believe, has been full of great information from the beginning to this point right here. And the commonality between what you just presented and the folks from the Office of Education Accountability is remarkable as we sit here and we can talk about high poverty, high performing schools. And how do we understand that better, and how do we identify the best practices of that? The question I have is simply, you gave some good examples regarding large districts and models to potentially think about. One, you described a school management system, and the other is curriculum instruction model. As I sit here and think about JCPS, and this is probably true of a lot, it seems like we need some of both. So I assume, even though they're characterized as such, they have some of both, or there's other examples that do combine both characteristics that are needed within a given district.
You know, in listening to, yes, sir, the simple answer to your question, let me answer your question first. Yes, sir. I personally think that the ideal would be to focus on a zone of schools, particularly the CSI schools in Jefferson County, to make them a zone, not separate them from the district, but to make them a zone of focus. Because when you focus on this and you have the belief and you put the resources in, you will be successful, I believe. And I think there's a lot of proof out there. I think both of these models are valuable because one is an accountability function and one is a curriculum and instruction function. So the NEST model in Houston is about curriculum instruction. But if you don't get better, then the System of Great Schools model addresses how you treat that school and what you do, whether it's restart or something else. I also think that it could be considered, in addition to that zone of schools, using, for example, a NEST model, but you could also do an ACE model. You could do all of these things, to be perfectly honest. And I think you try these things. That's the key here. You have to try something different than what you've been doing because you're getting the same results that you've been getting. So I would say yes, both of these models could be used, and others.
Okay, thank you. Last, we have we have Senator Nemes.
Thank you. And thanks for all the presenters, and thank you, Mr. Pistoric, for coming. But I think we see there is a way forward, and we are concerned about how to go forward. So we want to take our time to do it right. But you made a good point on the more time we take, the more children are left behind because they have no time. They're a certain age and they're moving through the school system and they're just going to be behind. So we need to do something quickly, but perfectly. And I think the ones that are in the system now, all of us, the legislators, the teachers, everyone is frustrated, and the ones that are working hard get defensive. And this is not what this is about, or anyone there that it is presenting. And then the ones like the legislators that want to get things done are being aggressive and are also frustrated. So this task force and that, there's been people on both sides pushing and shoving and saying this or that or another. But I want everyone to know that we want to make our students in Kentucky better than they are, whether you think they're falling behind or they're good. And then we want to move them to be excellent. We are going to make Kentucky students the best in the nation. Now, we're not there now, but that's what we strive to do, and that's what this task force is about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. Our last meeting will be on Monday, November 18th, here at the Capitol Annex 154 at 3 o'clock to hear from the State Auditor's Office about their work. Is there a motion to adjourn? We are adjourned.